Vikings were some of the most notorious warriors in 9th and 10th CE. Yet, we wonder, what rules applied to them, and how did they treat everyone else? First of all, we have to understand a man with the name of Eric the Red. Eric the Red was banished for killing Eyjolf after he killed his slaves. Eyjolf was not punished for what he did, but Eric was. He left Iceland and settled into what nowadays is called Greenland. So how did law during the ages of Vikings during 900 through 1500 contribute to the tragedies and consequences that could have been a triumph compared to the law that we have now and its tragedies and triumphs? Well, law affected Vikings and showed triumphs because they did not really have any rules that were established, unlike what we have today. This is important for history because it shows how law has changed over many centuries and how far our governments and society has come to. Because today, there are different degrees of breaking law, and most of them lead into many years in jail. This can be tragic, but states took out execution, unlike the Vikings, who basically had their own nation or army, who fought for themselves and had little or to no rules, but used mostly execution for rule breaking. The Icelandic sagas, as well as the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, describe the raids that Vikings held against usually the Anglo-Saxons in England. The Vikings also had brutal torture methods against their enemies that would make them go insane in the postcard chronicles. Back in their time period, Vikings were some of the most fearful warriors. Yet it seems like law didn't have an effect on them as they ruled on their own, but if there was rule breaking, it usually led to execution. In the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it states all the battles that have occurred in the times of Vikings, and in Gil's saga, it specifically focuses on the Vikings attacking England with their king Harold. Harold was the ruler of Norway and also a Viking that led to the others to victory. This was basically just what we would now call a corrupt government, as they did whatever they pleased with whoever, but it seemed to work as they succeeded in most of their raid attempts. The fact of not carrying gory rule breaking warriors led to make us never forget them. They're still in our world today, except in comics, video games, etc. The law also affected Vikings differently because they weren't as established and they were just trying to get territory. This is where Leif Erikson comes in. Leif Erikson is usually who we think about when it comes to the Vikings. He explored into Canada and set up an area of territory called Vinland, which is now a province called Newfoundland. There he improved and changed law to a more fair use as well as other parts of the world were. At one point in time, almost 1/4 of the world's land was ruled by Vikings. As they started to make settlements, they made stricter rules to have more humane society. Most of Norway has past ancestors of Vikings that still celebrate their traditions to have a similar way of law, even though there are more rules and regulations, but have recently banned capital punishment, or for say execution. Part of the reason why Vikings chose execution for unlawful acts was because they usually were traveling and didn't have time for such acts and didn't have jails to set up for prisoners. They also were cooped up and sometimes starving, so ended up stealing, murdering, etc. This caused dispute between Vikings when they were on a low period. Vikings also fought for practice and ended up murdering each other for rank and other things like being the alpha male. Their government was a monarchy at times with a Viking king, so things sometimes got out of hand. If the king wanted to execute someone, he did. Now, we have a government with equal powers on each branch, so it has to be a decision from all branches on a law to be passed and other things. The citizens are also able to vote in Norway and other places, that were once a place of different government. The Vikings were also trying to gain land while having a stable government so they could have more trade routes. Vikings also used these trade routes to gain resources for weapons, ships, and things that will help them during battles. Their enemies, however, were trying to do the exact same thing, so battles happened on a normal basis unless the Vikings were on a voyage specifically for exploration. England and other enemies built barriers for Vikings because they needed to control land, and they also show what parts are their territory, and passing these barriers means that there are going to be different laws to be obtained. Vikings were also some of the most advanced warriors, and their weapons are still standing in museums and other historical places around the world. These artifacts show just how advanced they were. This had an influence on later law that had to have with modern weapons today. The main conflicts were between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. The Anglo-Saxons and Vikings were constantly battling, and while the Anglo-Saxons took a more humane way of battling for land, the Vikings burned down houses, stole goods, and took all the land that they could get their hands on. This just shows how far our laws have come to, and just for stealing something could put you in jail for months. We also have a very controlled environment, so if someone does something bad, they will be dealt with properly. We also have way more resources and don't need to fight for them. Vikings, however, didn't even usually try joining with other countries, and just wanted power over resources, and they relied on war for that. Countries today have alliances with each other and share trade routes as well as resources. If we didn't have alliances, we would constantly be fighting for them. There was also different types of Vikings, just like there are different types of Danes, except they came from different races like Norwegian, Swedes, and Danes. They all came together with their different customs and came to agree on their own rules and regulations. With a bigger population, they combined their laws, similar today but triumphed back then because they had more opportunities with countries and could see their empire was growing by agreeing and showing relations with each other. It is tragic because later there was stronger racism and caused more tragedies, so countries had to keep on adding laws. There was also more banishing of criminals during the Viking period in Iceland, Sweden, and Norway. This had triumphed for those who have committed those crimes, because they could go start a new life somewhere else and didn't have a life sentence or capital punishment. Overall, law has changed mostly from the last few centuries, but older ages of civilizations like the Vikings had a great influence over it. Romans had what was called a republic, which has a great influence on America's government when it was created. Vikings had an influence over modern-day democracies as well as later centered pirates and thieves. They also had an influence on our military and modern-day weapons and tools that include knives, hammers, and especially the axe. They also had a moral reputation for bravery and courage. They had an influence over the NFL team and other college campuses. Their way of life has shown some of the most. They had an influence over an NFL team and other college campuses. Their way of life also shows some political views and religious standpoints regarding their way of life, their rules, and their mythology. Our law has been greatly triumphed from the past eras, especially the Vikings. Unfortunately, we have also had tragedies following similar beliefs, but we have learned from them. Thank you for watching.